I was in Brussels for several months during the spring and summer of 2001 to conduct some research at the Belgian State Archives. Much of Europe would be switching from national currencies to the euro, a unified currency, within the year. A currency union had been decided upon in the mid-1990s, and by 1999, the new euro was already being used in financial markets as a money of account, meaning that it wasn't in circulation, but it was being used in accounting. The euro was set to replace the national currencies on January 1st, 2002. While I was in Brussels, I had a small apartment not far from the archives. I often did my shopping at local markets and noticed that while my transactions were being settled in Belgian francs, prices were also displayed in the yet-to-be-released euro. In this way, citizens of the Eurozone countries could mentally begin to make the switch even before the euro was put into physical circulation. What struck me then, and continues to impress me today, is that in the space of about half a century, Europe was able to establish this unified currency and create an economic union that would span most of Western Europe. Even more than that, the European Union today includes a political dimension that provides its members with a mechanism for unified action beyond simple coordination. But to find the beginnings of the European Union, we'll have to go back to the uncertain days immediately after the Second World War, when so many of the ideas about what the future of Europe would look like begin to take shape. One of the earliest gatherings of the architects of a new Europe occurred in 1948 in the Netherlands. Some 750 delegates met at the Hague Congress to consider what form political cooperation might take in a post-war Europe. While there were many political leaders in attendance, few were currently serving as government ministers. The Congress also included historians, journalists, entrepreneurs, and church leaders. The idea was to bring together a wide range of opinions. The debate boiled down to those who favored a kind of watered-down United States of Europe that had been theorized during the 19th century, as opposed to those who preferred the formation of a classic international organization like the United Nations. The result was the Council of Europe, which combined the characteristics of both, although without forcing member states to give up sovereignty or even allowing the Council to make decisions that were binding on all of them. And this was really the crux of the issue. European states realized that they couldn't return to the individual extremes of economic nationalism that some of them had practiced during the interwar years, but they were unwilling to give up their political independence. So the choice was between an international organization and a supranational organization. And what's the difference? Well, international organizations, such as the United Nations, depend on the voluntary cooperation of their member states. International organizations work together toward a common goal, like peaceful coexistence or social reform, but they have no powers of coercion. In other words, they have no way to force member states to act in any particular way. Supranational organizations, on the other hand, require member states to give up at least some of their sovereignty. They include a mechanism to compel compliance with mandates. Now, why would countries want to accept membership in a supranational organization? This was indeed one part of the discussion at the Hague Congress that troubled some European leaders. There are a number of reasons we could point to that make supranational organizations attractive to states. Among them, I'll list the following. First, to eliminate the threat of war. Few Europeans wanted to return to the extreme nationalism of the early 20th century. Second, a feeling that the small nation state was becoming outmoded and that small nation states had no real voice in world affairs. This feeling was particularly acute once the Cold War got underway. 3, to tap into larger markets on an equal footing with other states. 4th, to allow greater specialization and competition. And 5th, to increase productivity and output by increasing access to raw materials and distribution networks. The United States began pushing for some kind of unified Europe after the Second World War, and the US-funded Marshall Plan to rebuild post-war Europe required at least some modicum of unity, or at a minimum, coordination among the beneficiaries. But European nations had a difficult time finding a common platform. The result was a creation of a variety of often short-lived international organizations. Well, the impetus for the creation of a truly supranational organization in Europe had a lot to do with keeping the peace. And it set out to do so through greater economic integration. You see, following the war, the victorious Allied forces were split on what to do about the defeated Germany. The United States and Great Britain favored the idea that Germany should be rebuilt and allowed to reindustrialize without oppressive restrictions. They viewed this as increasingly important once the Cold War dawned. The French, on the other hand, wanted to keep Germany weak in order to increase French industrial production at the expense of German industry. France's Monet Plan, named after Jean Monnet, the civil servant whose name it bears, called for giving France control over Germany's coal-rich Ruhr Valley. This had already been one of the terms at the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, so it wasn't a new concept. Monet wanted to increase French steel production to 150% of pre-war levels. To do that, he wanted the Ruhr under French control. And if that weren't feasible, then at least under the supervision of an international authority. But putting the Ruhr under French control would make it nearly impossible for German industry to recover. So the United States objected, fearing that a weak Germany would give Russia too much influence in the East. France did succeed at dismantling quite a bit of the German industrial capacity in the Ruhr. But in the end, the Germans objected, and the Americans supported the German position. So the French failed in their attempt to drum up international support to keep Germany weak. Instead, the Ruhr Valley was placed under the control of the newly created West German government after World War II, meaning that the West Germans would be able to produce steel at a much cheaper price than France would. This would threaten the viability of French steel on international markets. Oh, and everyone agreed that the only way to recover fully from the devastation of the war was to rebuild a strong industrial economy. So the only solution to France's problem was the creation of a supranational organization that would even the playing field by controlling West European coal and steel production. And the person who led the way at creating this supranational organization was the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. Schuman might appear to be an unlikely individual to lead the French effort to greater economic unity in Europe, and he almost didn't get the chance. But when we look at his background, it becomes clear that he might have been one of the few people who understood the problem of bringing Germany and France into closer cooperation. Schuman was born in Luxembourg to a local woman and to a German father. With this pedigree, it might sound odd that he would eventually go on to become the Prime Minister of France. But we need to understand the political turmoil of the second half of the 19th century to recognize why this was not outside the realm of possibility. You see, Schumann's father was actually born in France, in the disputed province of Lorraine on the border with Germany. Lorraine was ceded to Germany following the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. And Schumann's father, like the rest of the population of Lorraine, became German citizens. The son, young Robert, was educated in Luxembourg and in Metz, the capital of Lorraine, which at the time was a province of the German Empire. He attended universities in Germany and in the regional capital of Strasbourg in Alsace, which also was historically a French province, but at the time part of the German Empire. He eventually settled in Metz, where he practiced law. When World War I broke out, Schuman was a German citizen, though he avoided serving on active duty in the German army. Now, after World War I, the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France. So the populations of these two provinces, including Schumann himself, were declared French citizens, and his career in French politics began during these interwar years. When the Germans again invaded France at the outset of World War II, he continued in government for a time before resigning his post in the collaborationist Vichy government. He eventually became associated with the French resistance during the war, and after the Second World War, he returned to service in the French government. So Robert Schumann's background of moving seamlessly between German and French society put him in a somewhat unique position among French civil servants. He had an outlook that tended to transcend national interests, and he was very much a proponent of European integration, or even unification. While serving as the French foreign minister, Robert Schuman announced on May 9, 1950, a proposal to pool the coal and steel production of Western Europe. After almost a year of negotiations, the governments of France, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Italy signed a new Treaty of Paris, which created the European Coal and Steel Community, or the ECSC for short. It formed a supranational common market for coal and steel, including coke, iron ore, and scrap metal. Great Britain, by the way, declined to participate in the negotiations or the agreement. While many issues had led to the First and Second World Wars, territorial disputes over the rich coal and iron lands stood at the top of the list. So the territories of Alsace, Lorraine, Sarre, and the Ruhr, held variously by France and Germany over the years, were key to the future of the entire Western European steel industry. And to finding a way to minimize the competition over these territories would go a long way to keeping the peace. Even more than that, Schuman understood that an integrated coal and steel industry would enhance Western Europe's ability to recover after the war and to rebuild. The European coal and steel community created one common market for coal, steel, coke, and scrap metal out of what had been 6 national markets. The organization essentially eliminated internal tariffs on these products among the 6 signatories to the treaty. It also set a common external tariff on coal and steel exports. This might sound rather simple, but the treaty was pretty complex. While establishing a supranational organization with coercive powers, it also allowed for some national interests to be protected within member states. Now, one question jumps immediately to mind. If the European coal and steel community were to be established to decrease the chances that Germany would dominate European coal and steel industries, why would Germany agree to the terms of the treaty? Well, following the war, Germans had little to say over their future. The occupation armies made most governmental decisions, and the Ruhr remained under international authority for a time. When West Germany came into existence in 1949, its chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, wanted to get out from under the restrictions imposed by the occupying forces and to achieve full sovereignty. From Adenauer's perspective, the best way to do that was to cooperate fully with the French and other allies, and to do so on equal terms. The Treaty of Paris provided a medium through which West Germany could participate in deciding its fate. With the creation of the European coal and steel community, the constraints placed on West German coal and steel industries were removed. So one way to look at the Treaty of Paris is to think of it as West Germany participating for political motives and France participating for economic motives. The European coal and steel community's common market began fully functioning in 1953. Over the next 10 years, members' iron production increased by nearly half, from 62 metric tons to 92 metric tons. Trade within the community and with others was booming. But what of the supranational nature of the organization? Were there problems with member states giving up some of their sovereignty? With few exceptions, the organization worked remarkably well. The member states cooperated to uphold the common rules of the organization and even to pay a common tax to support the organization and its mission. In this way, the European coal and steel community proved that nation-states that had been at each other's throats for years could cooperate with one another. It also proved that a supranational organization was a viable solution to the problems Europe faced after the war. But it seems that this might apply only to economic integration. Greater political integration presented a much larger problem for those who envisioned a unified Europe. Now, at about the same time as Robert Schuman was proposing greater integration of Europe's coal and steel industries, the French Prime Minister, René Pleven, proposed a European defense community. The Cold War was now getting underway, and Pleven was concerned about the Americans' plan to allow West Germany to rearm and join NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was formed in 1949 as a check on Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. The French were still distrustful of Germany, and so Pleven's plan would create a European-wide army. Each national unit would report to its own national government, but the German army would report to a combined European Defense Community high authority. The European Defense Community, or EDC for short, called for a common budget and command structure, but the French Parliament was unwilling to cede any authority over its military to a supranational organization. So plans for the European Defense Community fell apart. With the failure of the EDC, the way forward for greater European integration looked to be through economic communities like the European Coal and Steel Community. And it was at a meeting of the foreign ministers of the steel community in Messina, Italy in 1955 that plans were sketched out for what would eventually become a full common market that would be free of tariffs among members. For the next 2 years, the 6 European coal and steel community countries negotiated the framework for this common market. And in May 1957, their leaders signed the Treaty of Rome, creating the European Economic Community, or EEC. The Treaty of Rome was a massive document containing something like 248 articles, 13 protocols, and 4 conventions, most of which needed to be hashed out over years. Ultimately, the goals would boil down to 3 important points. First, the treaty called for the gradual elimination among members of import duties and other restrictions on trade in manufactured goods. It would begin almost immediately, but was expected to take about a decade to accomplish. Second, the treaty asked the signatories to establish common agricultural policies, transportation policies, and social welfare policies. And third, the treaty suggested that members could not unilaterally renounce their memberships. This was challenged from time to time, but the common market was able to weather the occasional storm and retain its supranational character over the long term. In time, more European states joined. So at its inception, the European Economic Community had only 6 members. What about the rest of the non-communist European countries that did not want to join the supranational EEC, or could not due to constitutional issues? Well, Great Britain and 6 others, including the Scandinavian countries, along with Austria, Switzerland, and Portugal, banded together to create the European Free Trade Association. The European Free Trade Association sought to bring down tariffs between member states on manufactured goods only. It did not dictate tariffs on trade external to the group. This organization functioned well enough, and it continues to exist today in a smaller form. Great Britain and Denmark left the European Free Trade Association in 1973 to join the European Economic Community. Austria and Portugal left the next year. So the next nations admitted to the common market in 1973 were Great Britain, Denmark, and Ireland. Now, Great Britain had been invited to join the European Economic Community and the European Coal and Steel Community from the very outset. But it declined to do so because it wanted to focus on its own empire, which was still in existence in the 1950s, and because it opposed the creation of any power bloc on the continent. Besides, Britain was reluctant to give up any of its sovereignty to a supranational organization, no matter the potential benefit. But that was in the 1950s. Conditions were very different 15 years after the common market was founded. In retrospect, Great Britain's disinterest in joining the European Economic Community at its inception can be viewed as the biggest mistake the country made following the war. Great Britain was still the world's third most important power in 1945, but Britain was overextended and its economic outlook was not very good. While shedding its old colonies, the United Kingdom had hoped to keep them within its commercial orbit. But the former possessions were too poor for British goods. By the time Britain realized its mistake in the 1960s and applied for membership in the EEC, the French president, Charles de Gaulle, initially vetoed Britain's admittance. De Gaulle's veto was all politics. It had nothing to do with the common market, and his actions surprised some other members of the EEC. It was only after de Gaulle resigned as president of France in 1969 that the possibility of Great Britain joining the common market became likely. Some of the reasons the new French president, Georges Pompidou, supported British membership in the EEC were political as well. France had enjoyed an unexpectedly good relationship with Germany following the war, but Pompidou was uncomfortable with a move toward normalization of relationships between West Germany and Eastern Europe that was known as Ostpolitik. Even a greater concern was the growing power of Germany within the EEC. Since the organization's inception in 1957, the French had been its clear leader, but West Germany's growing economic strength brought it to more equal footing. Now the French saw Great Britain as a counterweight to the growing German influence. By the early 1970s, the post-war economic boom years were coming to an end. U.S. President Richard Nixon took the American dollar off the gold standard in 1971 in the face of increasing trade deficits and growing pressure on the greenback currency. Nixon's move essentially ended the Bretton Woods international monetary system that had prevailed since 1944. When war in the Middle East in 1973 sparked a global energy crisis, the United States provided weapons to Israel in response to the Yom Kippur Day attack by Egypt and Syria on Israel in October 1973. And the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, which included the Arab members of OPEC, plus Egypt and Syria, responded by putting an oil embargo in place. Oil prices shot up almost immediately. These two events, the end of the gold standard and the subsequent oil shock, more than any other, plunged the world into recession just as Great Britain was joining the European Economic Community. One of the EEC's chief goals at the time was to create a monetary union over about a 10-year period. But the global recession of the 1970s put a serious strain on the ability of the European Economic Community to function as a supranational organization. That's because its individual members felt compelled to pursue national economic policies. In this environment, monetary union was simply out of the question. And in any event, France and Germany couldn't agree about what character monetary union would take. The Germans wanted a common currency, while the French wanted a more limited arrangement that integrated banking and credit systems. And so, in spite of a variety of proposals, the decade came and went with virtually no movement toward the monetary union. Due to the recession, EEC member states were moving in the opposite direction, toward implementing protectionist measures. This came about even when the whole reason behind the common market had been to eliminate the nationalist economic policies that had caused so much ruin in Europe and led to two devastating wars. The European states were not ready to break up the common market, but caught in the throes of recession and bound to the rules of the supranational common market, the countries got creative in addressing the particular problems each faced. Since tariffs were forbidden by EEC rules, members erected non-tariff barriers to trade, such as regulations controlling environmental and safety concerns, for example. This restricted imports of goods that failed to meet the new regulations without actually setting up a tariff. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that circumstances had changed sufficiently to require a revision to the terms of the Treaty of Rome that had established the European Economic Community. Most European states now realized the only way to avoid the incremental protectionism that was stifling trade within the common market was even greater economic integration. In December 1985, the ministers of EEC member states, meeting at the Council of Europe, agreed to the text for a single European Act. The ministers' overriding goal was the creation of a single market in Europe by 1992. Now let's take a minute to think about what the difference might be between a common market, which is what the European Economic Community established in the years following the Treaty of Rome in 1957, and the single market that the EEC member states proposed now. Well, a common market allowed for the free movement of goods and services by eliminating tariffs and quotas among member states. But as we have seen, a common market falls short of full integration. Member states are free to pursue economic policies as long as these don't violate common market rules. So a common market coordinated some aspects of economic policy, but it did not amount to integration. A single market, on the other hand, goes several steps further. In a single market, all economic barriers are removed, meaning that goods and services and capital and labor can move as freely within the market as they can within a single country. And non-trade barriers that provide some protections under the common market are not allowed in a single market. The Council of Europe hoped to begin implementing the terms of the Single Europe Act by the end of 1986. But constitutional issues in several countries held up passage until January 1987. The Act changed some of the EEC's governmental structure to allow for a majority of members to change policy rather than requiring unanimity. This would prove to be particularly important over time as the number of members increased. Greece joined the EEC in 1981, and Spain and Portugal did so in the mid-1980s. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the retreat of communism in Eastern Europe, many more European states would set their sights on membership in the single Europe. So by the early 1990s, European governmental leaders were trying to figure out how to integrate EEC members into a single European Union, and what to do with all the Eastern European states that were expressing interest in membership. Many European leaders, including the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany, called for a political European Union ahead of the 1992 deadline for implementation of the single European market. But at a meeting of the European Council in Maastricht in December 1991, a political union went beyond what most member states were willing to do. The pinnacle of the Maastricht Conference was an agreement on the formation of the European Union to begin on November 1, 1993, and the creation of a common currency a few years later. The Maastricht Treaty also set the criteria by which states could join the common currency. For the rest of the decade, participating states sought to make the economic changes necessary to meet the criteria for joining the euro. Now, some members of the European Union, most notably Great Britain, elected not to join the common currency. But by 1998, 11 countries were eligible. The European Union is a supranational organization rather than a superstate. But the provisions of the Maastricht Treaty have created an atmosphere of significant unity. The European Union today unites a single market with standard laws and social services and the free movement of people, capital, goods, and services, thereby eliminating most border controls within member states. In this way, the dream of peaceful coexistence largely became true.